Hello and welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. Each week, our in-house experts sit down with special guests to discuss depictions of World War II on film. Sit back and get ready for a lively debate that will reveal the good and bad of how Hollywood shows the 20th century's most dramatic event. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and as always, we're sitting down with
Dr. Christelle Lefaucheur, a research historian at the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy here at the museum.
And today our special guests are Jason Dawsey, Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency Special Projects Historian.
Thanks for having me.
And Kim Geis, Assistant Director for Curatorial Services here at the museum.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Today we'll be discussing the 1963 film, The Great Escape. The film centers on the escape of Allied prisoners of war from a POW camp deep in the eastern portion of Nazi Germany in 1944. The Great Escape was directed by John Sturges and written by W.R. Burnett and James Clavell. It was based on the book by the same name written by Paul Brickhill. It stars Steve McQueen as Virgil Hiltz, James Garner as Henley, Richard Attenborough as Roger Bartlett, Charles Bronson as Danny the Tunnel King, and many more. The film was a critical success and one of the highest-grossing films of 1963. So, again, as we always do, the first question we ask everybody, and I'll start with one of our guests, and Kim, you're to my right, so I'll start with you, is, in your opinion, how accurate is The Great Escape?
Well, it is very accurate in some respects and not accurate at all in other respects. So, former POWs who watched the film said that there was, it was very detailed life and, anything in the camp. So they basically rebuilt part of the camp. So, in that way, it was extremely accurate. People watched it and said, that's exactly what it looked like. So it was partially very accurate. And, in other ways, it was, a gross exaggeration, very inaccurate. So, the American participation, for instance, in the escape effort was, fictionalized, I guess. The motorcycle, a lot of the adventure elements to the film were completely fabricated. Although, you could find maybe some of those elements in the larger POW narrative. In this instance, for this film, they were fabricated.
Yeah, there's a lot. I think that's a kind of a SOP with any World War II movie. There's accuracy in just about everything, and then there's inaccuracy in just about everything as well. What about you, Jason? What do you think?
I think it is also quite accurate. And I think Kim is right to point to the American role being exaggerated, even though who doesn't want to see Steve McQueen ride across Germany on a motorcycle in 1963, right?
Exactly.
And so I thought
do his own stunts too, by the way.
Right, and
Except for the last
one. But I think that seeing even the stuff that's fabricated in it it works, I think, in the film just in terms of its entertainment value. So I tended to look the other way with some of those points about the American role. But I think in terms of those aspects of it that are accurate, it was really interesting to see how they show the actual tunneling in it, and the back and forth, the kind of experimentation. This works. This isn't going to work. The Germans discovered this, so we take another route. I thought too the colonel. He's obviously got a different name. His name is Luger in the film, but he's based on the actual commandant of the camp was Lindiner, and Lindiner, the actual person, was an aristocrat who had a reputation for treating the prisoners quite well. And I thought the film really conveyed that about him, that he was a very kind of professional Luftwaffe officer from this elite background, and he approached the prisoners with a kind of paternalism in a way, and I thought the film showed that and the tensions that he had in real life with the SS and Gestapo. So I thought those aspects of the film I hadn't seen it in years, but I had just forgotten those elements of it, and I thought those parts of it were very well done.
Christelle, what about you?
Yeah, I would agree with you too. The logistics, I think, of doing the tunneling, preparing for the escape, I think, are very accurate. Kim already mentioned, the American prisoners had been moved to another camp, I think a couple of weeks, if not months before the escape. And also the kind of a simplification of the national makeup, not only with not British, but you also had Rhodesian, you had Dutch, you had Norwegian, you had so on, so on. So the movie hark back on this tradition of British POW film that has a long, long tradition, much longer than the American, of course, because the British, I don't want to say that they had more prisoners, but, right in 47 you had...
been at it longer.
Yeah, right, 47 you had first British films about POW, so it's a genre that existed in Britain for over, almost 2 decades, a decade and a half. So they do that, and then it's so simplified in a certain sense.
I agree with everybody here. I think there's a lot of accuracy to a lot of the movie, frankly, and everybody's mentioned the tunnel digging. Mm-hmm. One of the actual tunnel diggers from the movie, from the actual event, Wally, he was a Canadian, Wally Flutie was he was one of the consultants on the movie, and that's why the tunnel sequences were so damned accurate, because he insisted that they were. One of the there's a scene where James Coburn builds the ventilator, the hand pump ventilator, and Flutie made sure that it was an exact copy of the original one that they built in the camp. So the one that you see James Coburn pumping, demonstrating, is a dead ringer for the one that they actually built in the camp. And that's totally cool to have done that way back in 1963. You see that in a lot of movies today, like SPR and Schindler's List, like we've already reviewed. But way back in 63, they were doing that with extreme accuracy. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was really, really cool. You mentioned the layout of the camp. Right. And that was a dead ringer. It was in Bavaria when they filmed the movie. But still, it's dead on for what Zagan looked like during the war. And I thought that was really, really cool.
Well, the whole subplot of, collecting all those boards from beds and stuff and from wall, that was also true. I think, I don't know, I read a number, 2,000, close to 2,000 boards, something. So again, those logistics, the danger of digging the tunnel is because the Germans have built the camp specifically on the ground that was at a different type of soil. That's right. Making it difficult, and then, with the danger of collapsing like it did a few times in the camp. So, yeah, those actually I thought were kind of the gripping moment of the film. We see them laboring, and so the working of that I thought was quite interesting.
And there were also a lot of people around to advise, like you mentioned, Wally Flutie. True. It was at that time there were a lot of former POWs still, active and
a bunch of guys
vocal.
Who took part in the real escape, or not just Flutie, but others.
Sure, yeah. And then also, it harkens back to Brickell's book. So Brickell himself was a POW, so he, was able to portray with some accuracy the events. Yeah. And then Donald Pleasance, who I love, we can talk about him later. But, he was a POW as well. So, of course, Colin Blythe, he was in Stalag Luft I. So not Stalag Luft III, but still, he went through a lot of those same experiences.
Yeah, there's a lot of accuracy to it. There's a lot of Hollywood fiction, but there's a lot of you mentioned the dirt. Yeah. And the way that they hid the dirt.
I love this scene.
It's so cool, but it's true. That's that's what they did.
Well, this is almost, I don't want to say the mythos, but the British ingenuity. It's like, we have a problem, we're going to fix it. But it's just such a cute scene. But there's a lot of little elements about the experience in the war, in the camp. The receiving the rations, and also having those Russian workers. We could even, and I think Jason can talk about that, call them slave worker, basically doing the hard work of cutting down the trees around, again, to prevent escape, because if you have nothing to hide right on the periphery of the... So that was, I think, giving us a context of the camp.
I also like the way they show the division of labor among the prisoners, So-and-so's a digger, so-and-so's a forger. The way they cooperate. The guys are singing, outside while they're chipping away. That the coordination that it took to do months of work, I thought the film, it really does show that. This is going to take a long time. If you're going to tunnel 30 feet down and then, 300 feet out, I think, beyond to get, they obviously wanted to get to beyond the tree line. That's going to take a lot of work. And to be able to cover that up for all that time, and I thought that's one of the things I really enjoyed about the film again, was seeing them, how they did that, how they pulled that off.
I read there were over 600 people involved in all this Sterling. That's an enormous amount of organization, as logistics, as you said, yeah.
And the security involved in that as well. Because, you're inside. Stalag 17. Stalag Luft III had around 1,800 POWs in it at that time when the actual escape occurred. So, if you say, 600 plus or minus a few, obviously, that's a good portion of the camp. It's a third of the camp,
Yeah.
And you got to figure that just about everybody knew what was going on, and yet it was kind of held tight. Something I read that I did not know, I have to admit, was that some of these guys were aided by the Germans to get out. They got their hands on, miraculously, got their hands on German Ausweises and Soldbooks and things like that, and they didn't steal them. They were given them. And that's something that the movie obviously does not show. But that's pretty fascinating, too, when you think about it.
And it had been such a center for escape attempts already. There's an attempt late spring of 1943, like 25 or 30 British airmen break out. They're virtually all recaptured. But it had this reputation as being an escape center, a problem before the breakout in March of 44 that the film represents. And you actually see that where these SS and Gestapo officials are talking to Luger, the commandant, and they bring in Richard Attenborough's character, Bartlett. And his real name is Bushell. And they bring him in and basically say, if we have to deal with this guy again, we're going to execute him. That these kind of, and I think the film kind of gestures at that. It hints at this earlier history. It's obviously focused on this major escape, but it had that reputation already.
Yeah, well, they say in the movie, Von Luger says in the beginning of the movie, he says, we've put all of our rotten eggs in one basket. Yes. And then, to a degree, they did. Bartlett or Bushell was obviously there, and he was an escape artist as well, as were some of the other people that were there, too. Let's move on and discuss the overall POW experience in reality versus the depiction in the film. Kim, you kind of touched on it a little bit when you started, but there's a lot of real things that I think they depict in here. And there's some of the things that they miss, and one of the things that's kind of glaring to me in this movie that they do miss is food. Mm-hmm. They don't talk about food, and if you talk to any Allied prisoner of war from Europe, the first thing when you ask them, what were you thinking about when you got out, when you were released or liberated or whatever you want to call it? You thinking they're going to say, the girl back home and mom. No, I wanted a hamburger. First thing they were thinking about was chow because they were starving. And the movie does not show that at all. These guys are all very well, they're in good shape. They're in good shape. Nobody's sick. I think somebody has a cold at one point, but really. But nobody has dysentery. Nobody has, hepatitis, which were rampant in the POW camps in Europe. And, they do, as you mentioned, they do mention the Red Cross parcels, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. And they were few, they got them, but they were few and far between.
Yeah, especially fall of 43, spring of 44. The Allied bombing increased to such a level that the whole Red Cross organization was completely disrupted. But it's interesting because in the film, they indicate or point towards the fact that the Germans are missing all those things. One of the way that the James Garner character is able to get his hand on some of the material they need is by trading or offering some of the chocolate and coffee, and the Germans the image we're giving is that the Germans, hasn't had good coffee in a while, or no chocolate, or no butter, or something like that, which was also true.
Exactly.
But it's interesting that I totally agree with you, Seth. The Americans seem to be perfectly contented and no need at all for all those things, and have coffee hot on the plate at any availability because
And you nailed it too, because you said the Germans were suffering too, and they were. And I mean the prisoners of war were starving because the Germans were starving too.
Yeah.
And again, you said it perfectly when you said that Germany was being bombed around the clock, and the last thing that the Reich was worried about was feeding their prisoners when they couldn't feed their own people, and it was more of a pressing need to feed their soldiers than Americans and Brits and Canadians who've been shot down. So I think there's one little tidbit. I don't remember which one of the POWs that I interviewed said this, but they talked about the bread and the soup, that they were often fed soup, and it was like gruel. It was basically water with a leaf floating in it or something.
One guy called it grass soup.
Grass soup, yeah. And the bread, the ersatz bread, it was like 80% sawdust, and it looked like a piece of cork, so they called it coaster bread because it looked like a drink coaster.
I know in here they have enough potatoes to make some moonshine. And
Yeah.
I'm just like, well, first of all, they had enough potatoes. And then, they were able to make some moonshine without everybody noticing or the Germans saying anything. That was one of those. I mean, you made for a nice comic or very American scene after that.
I mean, there are elements. There are lots of accounts of people actually making alcohol,
Yeah.
but on that scale, that's pretty epic. I don't know that happened. That's like brewery level. But yeah, you're right. It is very misleading that they do, concentrate on the things that they had that they were able to barter with, and that did occur. But yeah, they don't talk about the lack.
Yeah, and that's something. And I'm not knocking the movie for that, but it's an important aspect of POW life in Europe, and it's completely missed in this movie. Although that being said, this movie's not about POW life. It's about the Great Escape. It's about trying to get out of this camp. And, to that degree, I'll give it a pass. But it's something that we needed to talk about.
I think it's also we should also, I think, keep in mind, too, like if this film had been set like 6 months later, like the fall of 44 and after, then food would be paramount. It would be the issue, late 44, early 45. But it's March of 44 is Eastern Germany. Back then, it will become Poland. So the Allied air war is a problem, but it's not a huge problem for this area yet, as it will be a little later in the war. But still, I agree with everything said. The fact is Red Cross parcels were huge. And German rations had been an issue for months in Stalag Luft III and these other camps. They just were insufficient. And so you just get the image of these prisoners is that they're pretty well fed. They don't really have to worry about food very much at all. And so they can focus all their time on trying to break out.
And energy. It took some energy to dig a tunnel.
Yeah.
Some muscles, yeah.
You don't see any of that really at all, the whole everyday life.
What camp was it? Kim, you might know this. I want to say it was Barth, but I could be wrong there, that when the camp was liberated, they found a warehouse full of Red Cross parcels that the Germans had been hoarding and that they had not distributed to the POWs who were starving.
Mm-hmm. I think that was Stalag Luft I in Barth.
Yeah.
It's rare, though. I mean,
It is. It is, but it happened. It happened. Well, let's talk about another topic, and this is something that is said directly in the movie. That can't remember the squadron leader, the senior officer, British officer in the movie, the senior British officer. He says that it's an officer's duty to escape. So let's talk about this escape as a duty. Is that a fact or is that a myth? Hit it.
It's a myth.
It is. It totally is.
And I have to say, I understand that the movie is about an escape, but I thought that this earlier part, and then especially at the end, where something we're going to talk about, in a certain sense, justifying the death of 50 of those escapees, I thought that was ethically and morally questionable. There was nothing on the book that they said that it was a duty of the officer. I think it's completely made up. When they were shot down, yes, their duty was to do everything they could to escape being in prison. But once they're in prison, or in the camp. They're in the camp, and the majority of prisoners just waited the war out. I mean, one have to say that, some were terrified to go back to the front. Others, just felt like they physically, because they had no food or were injured, could not escape. And then there's really a question that I think the movie completely pass over, which is, well, once you escape, what are you doing?
Yeah, where are you
You're not
going?
speaking the language. You're dressed, in whatever attire. You cannot, often do not quite know where you are, where to go. I mean, chances of successful escape are really, really very minimal. So yes, this is a complete myth.
And I think, again, kind of touching on what you said too, Jason, depending on the time and the location of the camp, escape would have been a more pleasurable thing to think about as opposed to, something out in eastern Poland in 1944. If this is Hammelburg, Germany, shall we say, in March of 1945, when the Western Allies, the American Army in particular, is less than 100 miles away, you got the opportunity, you're going to bolt if you have the opportunity. But when you're with the hell out in Poland and the Allies haven't even landed in mainland Europe yet, where are you going to go? And that's I agree with you. It's a myth.
Yeah, I mean, the plan was indeed for a lot of them to go to Switzerland.
Sure.
And interestingly enough, there were only 3 prisoners that managed to escape, 2 Norwegian and 1 Dutch, not even British and American. And, the idea to pass as a French-speaking one, being myself a French-speaking person and having been around a lot of Americans or British that try to speak French, that would have been, immediately detectable. And same thing for German. I mean, this is, it's not a language. The accent is so strong. So I think, I don't know. I thought there's a relatively recent book called The Real Great Escape by Guy Walters, where he tackled that and really explained that the leader, Mr. X, was kind of this. There's a small scene in the movie where he described his plan, and everybody looking at him thinking, I mean, on their face you could see thinking, you're just crazy.
Yeah, you're a lunatic.
Why would we do that? And then yet they go along. Maybe they're bored. Maybe they need a goal, which was an important aspect. You need something to work towards. Otherwise, you kind of, what are you doing in the camp? But yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure it was justifying 50 deaths.
I mean, I think the idea of escape was in probably all of their minds at some point.
Yeah.
I mean, who the hell wants to sit behind a barbed wire? You're in jail. I don't care if you're sitting there with 1,800 of your closest friends. You're in jail. So the idea of escape was always there, but it was the question of A, how, B, where. Where are you going to go? Kim?
Yeah, one former POW recalled, the escape as he described it as occupational therapy
There you go.
with a goal.
Yeah.
So it was, something to do, something to keep you busy. It felt productive. It took up the hours. He also talked about how, in civilian life, you would try to do everything as efficiently as possible and as, save time. In the camp, it was the opposite. You really stretched out every little task. So that escape was a way to, feel useful, to, occupational therapy.
No, absolutely.
I really like the portrayal of Ives in the early part of the film from Scotland.
Archibald
And he's in there. He's working with McQueen, Hiltz a number of times, and he has I think what the term was wire
happy.
Wire happy was the term, right? That he had been in there so long, presumably since 1940, maybe wasn't sure, but he had been in there a long time, and or had been a prisoner a long time. And he was doing it to keep his sanity. He had just been behind barbed wire for so many years that he couldn't take it any longer. And you can kind of see that happening with him. Each time he's brought back, he's put in the cooler, he tries again, and that's coming. And McQueen obviously tries to save him, but it's too late. I mean, he just couldn't bear it, any longer.
And, we talked about accuracy. That's actually something that did happen. There was a fellow named Jimmy Cadell who did that in Stalag Luft III. He had escaped so many times, and he was, quote, unquote, wire happy. He needed to get out. by any means possible. And one day he had had enough, and he went straight to the wire. Broad daylight right in front of the guard tower, climbed up the wire, and they shot him. And, I mean, that – so, again, the movie does have its accuracies, and that's while they changed the names, that's an event that happened at that camp. So.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to show because, being wire happy, or they called it barbed wire fever, it's sort of the counterpoint maybe, I guess, to this hero escape. I'm going to escape. A lot of people really just couldn't take it, just that intense forced introspection. And, there was also another sort of camp character that wasn't really shown, and that's, you hear this a lot, the sack artist. And those are the people that would just sleep 24/7 because they were depressed, basically, So what am I going to do? I'm just going to sleep. So just really, that's a different kind of escape, I guess, when you think about it, escaping into yourself. But I think Ives is an important character for that reason.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things, coming back to the experience of the camp, they did organize some choir and some classes and some gardening, for the same reason, just to keep themselves busy and do something.
There's some absolutely terrifying photos of a stage show, I think at Oflag 64, where a bunch of dudes are dressed in drag and they are ugly women. And they're putting on a stage show, again, A, for entertainment, but B, to keep themselves sane because there was not much to do. There wasn't a whole hell of a lot to do. So, yeah, you gardened and you gambled and you played cards and you put on shows and all kinds of other things to occupy, the body and the mind. And I mean, you've got all the POW journals, Kim.
Yeah.
And, these guys kept these journals. They were issued by the Red Cross, weren't they? The journals, the
books.
They
were printed by the Red Cross.
Printed by the Red Cross. And, I mean, you see some of the art in these things, and it's exquisite because, I mean, these dudes had a lot of time to practice. So, I mean, it's beautiful. They're really, really totally cool.
And Don Pleasance actually was a performer in Stalag Luft I. So our forger, again, I'm going to come back to him all the time, Colin Blythe, he was part of that theater in Stalag Luft I. So he produced plays and put on some of those stage shows. But
yeah, it's also just interesting that, you think about a camp like Stalag Luft III where these officers, according to the Geneva Convention, they don't have to work. So, if you're doing a film about a different stalag, you think about Stalag 17 or you think about other camps you could do a film about, then you'd have to show prisoners, talking about especially lots of enlisted men in a camp, they're going to be sent to labor details, that they're going to have a lot less time to tunnel or garden or whatever. So that varied a lot from camp to camp. And it's interesting. In this case, we're seeing a lot of officers are not required to work under the Geneva Convention, and von Luger he follows that at least pretty scrupulously, and so they have these opportunities. But if you had done a film about another camp, you'd have to show guys who are doing factory work, or they're doing agricultural labor, or they're doing construction work, which many of them did.
Not as glamorous.
Yeah, and they didn't have as much time on their
Exactly.
hands either.
Exactly.
So, all of the journals and written material that we have from enlisted prisoners, you don't see nearly as much narrative or sketches or anything that took a lot of time because, you were exhausted from working.
Well, we talked about, the escape as a duty and all that, but they did occur. I mean, obviously this one occurred, but there were actually even other larger mass escapes. But it did happen. What was the frequency that they happened? I mean, I can't, one a month or anything like that, stupid. But what they did happen, and they did happen relatively often. Can one of you guys talk on that?
I don't know. I mean, I just, reading specifically about this film, as Kim mentioned earlier, it's kind of a put together of different escapes that we know of. Like, for example, when James Garner steals the plane, that happened, but it was a year earlier, maybe in this camp or in another one. So they kind of took examples of different escapes and say, okay, we're going to put all possible things here. I don't know. I think I read there was something like 10 or 11, what they call great escape, which is a number that's higher than 25 or something like that. But yeah, I can't imagine even trying to do that. I was wondering, though, maybe Jason could answer that. In the film, that comes from the Gestapo, but there's this statement made that if you escape again, if you escaped and you caught, you considered a spy, which is, I don't know if it was an argument they use or, a pretext. But basically, as a spy, now we have the rights to shoot you. It's not anymore under the Geneva Convention. Was it actually the case?
Yeah, and I think Kim might also want to jump in on this too. But, it's 44, and Seth had mentioned the air war. And so the kind of propaganda coming out of the regime about air gangsters and terrorists, that has been increasing. And Hitler's frustration with the bombing and the Luftwaffe's inability to stop it, what you're getting more and more of is saying, well, if we can't stop it in the air, one thing we might do is start killing pilots that we have captured as a way of deterring attacks. And that's talked about at a very high level. And Hitler is, he and Goebbels are continually weighing that. So one of the things that's being discussed, of course, is letting the SS and Gestapo have a greater role in dealing with POWs. And so that there is an element of truth in that. That would have not have been the case, say, even a year earlier. But by 44, you're seeing it. And the SS and Gestapo do play more of a role in that last year of the war regarding POWs.
There was a document, a little booklet that the War Department issued called "If You Should Be Captured, These Are Your Rights." And it's really small, it's not very much information, frankly. And it's kind of done with cartoon drawings, but it was issued to air crews and talks very sort of fleetingly about the Geneva Conventions and what to do. And I reviewed it again recently just to review the rules on escape. And is it referred to as a duty ever? No. But there is a mention that, if you have managed to escape and are recaptured, that you should not be penalized for that one escape attempt. Basically, like, that's in the past. So they don't actively discourage it, but it is mentioned that basically if you commit a crime while you escape, so if you commit a crime that, say, a civilian would be punished for committing, if you steal an apple or steal food while you're out, while you've escaped, then you could be punished for that. So, the rules were very loose. So, even if you weren't punished technically for escaping, you would have been punished for something else.
And they would have done what they did in the movie. They would have thrown them in the cooler.
Sure.
They'd have thrown them in solitary.
Right.
And
so
let
that
them sit
was
there for a few
mentioned.
days.
Yeah, up to 30 days was the allowable punishment mentioned in this booklet.
Well, let's talk about the relations between the Wehrmacht, the SS, and the Gestapo, and the prisoners of war, and the depiction of the Germans in this movie in particular. You're shaking your head, Christelle.
Take it away.
I'm going to go to you now. Go for it. Let her rip.
Well, let me start saying that I appreciated the fact that there was actually different types of Germans. It wasn't just kind of this monolithic, barking German,
Robotic,
halt, or something like that. So we did have, we had, as Jason mentioned, we had this kind of a career military German, the Luftwaffe officer who, one assumes, based on the depiction, follows a set of standard and guideline that he has internalized and learned and want to treat the other officers, even if they're enemies, in the same respectful way, let's say. Then, of course, we have the Gestapo, with his trench coats, not quite the black suit, but a little bit like that. And of course, they're brutal, and of course, they do not hesitate right away of killing the prisoner, which happened. So good for that. The one that really, really hurts me and, me and my German relatives, I, of course, what is called the goons. Yeah, basically this is the same Tommy foxing dim-witted Fritz story. The British and the American are so smart and then just outsmart the really, really naive, really not very smart German guards. And it's such a cliche. Yes. So that was a little disappointing.
Yeah, and I mean, I know a lot of the German guards, especially 44, they weren't frontline troops. They were if they were convalescing from some sort of wound or ailment or something like that. In a lot of cases, I know late war, especially late war, like really late war, they were old men, and when they heard the rumble of distant artillery, they were gone in the blink of an eye because they wanted no part of anything. Or they'd surrender to the prisoners themselves. Say, here's my K-98. Watch over me. Tell them I treated you okay when they get here, But, since we're talking about it, one of the Germans in the movie, we alluded to this earlier, was, and we can get to this in a second, but there's a lot of characters in this movie that were based off of real people. Actually, most of the characters are based off of real people. And some of them, as Kim said, like Donald Pleasance was a prisoner of war during World War II. So was one of the German guards. He's listed in the movie as Till Kive, but his actual name was, this guy is fascinating. His name is Edward Kiefer. And Kiefer was in the German Hermann Göring Panzer Division in reality. And he was a Knight's Cross recipient. He plays Feldwebel Frick, who's the guy who finds them coming out of the tunnel in the middle of the night. As I said, he was a Knight's Cross recipient. He was awarded the Knight's Cross for actions in North Africa. He was captured in North Africa in 1943. And this guy made at least 3 separate escape attempts from American prisoner of war camps in the United States, 2 of which were by tunneling, ironically enough. Guy got caught the first time in a train station in St. Louis because some worker thought he was dressed funny. And what he had done is he'd taken his German uniform, his Luftwaffe Feldblues, and he had dyed it to look like a suit jacket, but it still looked like a wool Luftwaffe jacket because he didn't have too much, to work with. And they busted him there. And the next time, it might have been the last time they caught him, he literally was within yards of the Mexican border when he was arrested by Border Patrol. And I mean, this is a real guy who, after the war, went back to Germany and became an actor, and he is in no other movie but The Great Escape, playing the guy who finds the guys coming out of the tunnel because he himself was a tunneler. And that's just fascinating. Seen this movie 100 times, never had any idea that this guy is, a holder of the Knight's Cross and an escapee himself. So truth is stranger than fiction half the time.
Wasn't Hannes Messemer who plays the commandant? Didn't he serve on the Eastern Front during the war as well?
And he
was captured.
A POW
and he
as well.
was also captured, I think.
Well, as Kim mentioned, it's 1962 when they started doing the shooting. I mean, we're less than 15 years ago from the war. So if you have anybody that's above 40, 45, chances are, they were themselves involved, in the German military in some ways or another. So. But again, what's the name of the
guard?
The guard that James Garner is tricking.
Werner.
Yeah, I mean, this is such this is Hogan's Heroes all over. I mean, although I have to say there is an attempt of a little bit of character development. We have a little bit of a history when he mentioned that he was a Boy Scout, and then against his will. He was banned, and then he was switched to the Hitler Youth. So there was an indication, I think, which again I appreciated in the movie, that not all Germans are hardcore, Nazis and eager to kill everybody. He was just swooping what was happening back then, and he's a nice guy. It's just he's not very smart.
Talks about the dentist being a butcher, but he's afraid to say that because he'll be shipped to the Eastern Front, which is true.
Yeah, it's true too.
Yeah,
exactly.
to the Eastern Front.
Well, there are all these different stories, too, of some of the guards attending reunions after the war, which is just crazy. It's unthinkable that one of your captors, one of the guards, would come to one of your reunions, but they actually did in some instances. Which...
I mean, and we can talk about this in a later movie, but there's a distinct difference between, and I won't get into it, but it's a distinct difference between being a prisoner of the Japanese and a prisoner of the Germans.
Oh, most definitely.
Totally different world, and I can't see a Japanese guard going to an American reunion. He would not have gotten out of there had he showed up.
Well, it's already an early kind of globalization. There's a shared culture. The Germans loved American movies. They always knew tidbits of British, a little bit of English. So there's a little bit more of a connection there. And as you mentioned, Seth, earlier, by 1944, they can hear the thing on the wall.
Rumble or
rumble on the wall.
Yeah.
So there's like as you said, that the Ausweis wasn't stolen; it was actually given. Like, I treat you well, I help you. In a couple of weeks when the Russians are here, please, do the same. So
yeah. And that was very real. Yeah. These guys had to watch out for themselves too.
Yeah, I thought that the scene too with the commandant early in the film, where he's very reluctant to say Heil Hitler. And seems to have been accurate about the real life Commandant Lindiner, that he was a conservative nationalist, but not really a committed Nazi, and so he always had some distance to the regime. And the SS, actually more the Gestapo, paid very close attention to that too, and so did local party officials. That they kind of sensed that we're not really so sure the Commandant is kind of fully on board with everything here, but he was such a professional. And he had the confidence of people, superiors in the Luftwaffe, that he stayed until that escape, and then of course was court-martialed after that. But
I'm sorry, Krista. What you're talking about him? I don't know. What happened to the actual man after he was he executed?
Well, Hitler wanted him executed, but he's talked out of it, and then they have him court-martialed, even though there's all these delays, and then he's court-martialed, and then there's people who intervene, and he's sent to an army hospital where he stays for several months. And he, when he's interviewed later, he just says, I was really lucky. I was very lucky, given the fact that there were people who wanted my head, there. But Hitler had actually wanted him put to death, but he's talked out of that. And then all of these battles take place over what's to be done with him. And he eventually is court-martialed, sentenced, but then he ends up, someone intervenes and says, we think that Colonel Lindiner is suffering from mental illness. And so he actually gets to spend time in an army hospital for a while, and that keeps him alive.
Well, Goering's was somehow protective of, Luftwaffe men, so it might be that, I don't know if he was the one that intervened or not, but yeah.
I didn't know that. Let's talk about, one thing I think before we move on, we just need to address, we talked about accuracies and inaccuracies, and we'll get to the next topic in just a second. One thing that is very accurate in the movie, and we need to point this out because, we always go back and forth between what's real and what's not, is the execution of the 50. That did happen. I mean, it was portrayed in the movies. I don't think it happened exactly like they showed it in the movie, but that's doesn't matter. There were 50 of these men. I think 76 got out and 73 were recaptured, and 50 were executed on Hitler's orders. Now, how they were executed, I don't know. But, I'm sure it was a shot to the back of the head. But regardless of that is shown in the movie. It is accurate, and that's, and what I think is really cool is that when this news was broken to Lindiner, in reality, he allowed the prisoners, both the guys who had returned or were returned to the camp and those who were still there, to build a memorial to these guys, the 50 who were killed. He allowed them to do that in the camp during the war. And that's really good. I don't know how else to say that, but that's a tip of the hat to the man there. And because he was appalled when he heard that news, much like von Luger is in the movie. He was, very reluctant to tell the senior British officer, whose name escapes me, the news because he was ashamed. And I think that's pretty damn accurate as well.
That memorial is one of the only actual physical things,
still there,
original pieces still there in Jagan.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
It's also just worth saying here about the decision that Hitler, speaking of intervening, he wanted all 73 of them that had been recaptured executed, and he's talked out of that. And he then says, well, I'll leave it to Himmler to decide how many. And Himmler, in turn, delegates. And we think that it was this individual named Arthur Nebe, a kind of police figure working for Himmler, who selects the 50. And obviously there was never any they were never able to determine that because Nebe was implicated later in the July 20th plot and is in turn tried and executed by the SS. So we don't really know for sure if Nebe was the one, but they do. He is the person usually given assigned blame for selecting which 50. And as Christelle mentioned, probably what happened to most of them, they're told they're going to be taken to the camp, they're brought out to some area, and then shot. And that's usually what happened to most of them in ones and twos is what seemed to be the case.
Yeah, and a number of the soldiers that actually did the killing were put to trial in 1947, and I think 13 or 15 were executed. So,
well, pop culture references to The Great Escape. This is a classic movie, like it or not. It's around, been around since '63, and it ain't going anywhere anytime soon. Let's talk about the pop culture references. You know, it's become the go-to depiction of prisoners of war and World War, well, prisoners of war, period, really. Good or bad?
I think, you know, it is good in the sense that you get to see a major escape, and the fact that the Bartlett character, Bushell, he wanted to break out 200 to 250 people. I mean, they I think 80 of them get out, and 4 captured right away, and then 76 get out, and then all but 3. But I think that sense, if you're looking for a film that's going to talk about people who escaped, were trying to escape, it is the go-to film. Sure. It is.
But is it the go-to film for life of prisoners of war? My answer is no. Absolutely not.
But it did bring the prisoner of war experience to the forefront for, you know, it brought it to the big screen in a popular way.
It did.
So
sure.
in terms of...
Because of the people that were in it.
In terms of, you know, popularizing the prisoner of war experience, or maybe presenting the prisoner of war as someone who could be a hero and not just a loser who sat behind barbed wire. You know, that's another thing that kind of to consider. Not that it's perfect and it should be the go-to, but, you know, it did bring those prisoners of war into the discussion.
Yeah, and it's different than other prisoner of war movies in that one of the movies that will eventually do, Stalag 17, was obviously done many years before this, and in my personal opinion, it's a better film. But it was really the first American film to bring the prisoner of war, as far as I know. Christelle,
American film, yes. As I said, the British had like 20 plus movie before.
Hollywood flick. This is the first
Hollywood
one,
flick, yeah.
and it's
well, unless you count the bridge over the River Kwai, which is also a prisoner of war.
Right.
Which kind of started this.
But
this move.
different theater, though.
Different, but
totally
still.
Different, yeah. But as far as our European prisoner experience, Stalag 17 is the first, and that actually does show life in the camp, I think, a little
in a much better
more.
way. Yeah, absolutely.
But let's talk about. Well, let's cut to the chase, and I'll start with you, Kim, because you're sitting next to me. Did you like The Great Escape, and would you recommend it?
Of course, I'd recommend it. It's a classic. It's a classic film that has a lot of, you know, elements of fact within it. A lot of, you know, fiction as well. It's long. You kind of have to want to stick with it, you know. So I would recommend it to someone who's a little older, maybe with an attention span that can handle it. But yes, I'd recommend it. No.
Jason?
I would definitely recommend it. I mean, I think with all the caveats we said that this is a film about escaping, it's not going to be any great insight into life in the camp, but it's great. And I think, you know, to also just mention, we've talked a lot about I mentioned McQueen and Attenborough, but it was also just great to see Bronson in this film, Charles Bronson, and he had also, like James Coburn, been in The Magnificent Seven a few years earlier with Sturgis, and so it was great to see the two of them. And I'm not like won over so much by Coburn's Australian accent. You know, he plays an Australian, but it's great seeing him in that role, and the fact that he's one of those that gets out. I think it's obviously not historically accurate, as Christelle mentioned. Norwegian and Dutch prisoners get out, but I was rooting for James Coburn especially as much as I was for McQueen.
Yeah, it really kind of, when you mention it, it is kind of a rehash of The Magnificent Seven. Steve McQueen's in it, and Coburn's in it. I never thought about that till you just said it. Christelle, what about you?
Well, yes, I would recommend it as a like Kim said, just settle in comfortably, have some big bag of popcorn, just take your time. For me, it's almost like a heist movie. It's like the preparation, the logistic of it doing all. I don't think it's a very good movie about life in the camp. But as a kind of suspenseful, are they going to make it? Yes or no? I thought I would recommend it. I wish they will cut the kind of morally ambivalent exchange at the end where, was it worth it, to have 50 dead? Yes, it was, or something like that. But otherwise, yes, it's a good popcorn movie.
I would agree. I like this movie. I always have. It's exceedingly long. But, you know that going into it. And like you said, just sit back with them.
I have to say it has a good rhythm, although it's being long. The only thing that for me was long was this bike chase. But otherwise, the whole thing really progresses, a nice progression. Okay, there's danger, they're doing this, they're doing that, they're escaping. You follow that along, but then the chase was just,
it's like Bullet on a smaller budget.
Yeah, you were like, okay, come on. Yeah.
Which is a great movie, too, by the way.
It is classic.
Great cars in that movie. But anyway, I would definitely. I like this movie. I always have, as I said, and I would definitely recommend it. It's a fun movie, and I know parts of it are not meant to be fun by any means, but it is. I mean, you got to take it for what it is. It's a movie about this one event, and for that, if you look at it in that light, I think it's pretty damn accurate for all the reasons that we said, and of course there are inaccuracies too, but overall, I think a movie about this particular event, I think it's accurate. You talked about the Americans, and there were several Americans that were part of the X organization, but they, as you had mentioned, they were moved out, I think, 7 months before. So it was a significant amount of time. But there were guys that dug tunnels. I knew two of them. There were two pretty famous American aviators. David Jones, who was a Doolittle Raider, was a tunnel digger.
So can I just interject a quick question about that? Is that how common was it, the James Garner character, who's an American serving in the British military, how often did that happen?
It happened a lot in the beginning of the war, but at this point, if it would have been 44, well, I say that. I don't know when Garner's character was supposedly shot down. I have no idea.
I thought he's supposed to be with the Canadian in the film, isn't he? Does he have a British uniform? James Garner?
He does, but here's the thing: is it before the United States got involved?
Yeah, they volunteered.
Yeah, they went across the border and flew with the RCAF, including a Medal of Honor recipient who later was put back in the American Army Air Forces, John Morgan. He did that very thing. He flew with the RCAF, and then when the U.S. got into the war, he was put back, where he belonged, and he was awarded the Medal of Honor. But regardless of that, I don't know when Garner was shot down, so I can't comment on that. If he was theoretically shot down in 1940 or even 41, hell, even 42, it would have been perfectly legit for him to be still wearing that RCAF uniform or RAF uniform, because he would not have been transferred, because he couldn't have been, because he wasn't he was a prisoner of war. But had he been shot down in 44, then no. But I
was certainly curious.
That did definitely happen. Yeah, there were Americans in foreign service, shall we say? But and it's little things like that. And again, I don't think, and I could be wrong, but I don't think that there were any Americans who were in the RCAF or RAF or whatever, Eagle Squadrons, whatever it may be, that was part of that particular escape. Maybe there was. I don't know, 600 guys. Maybe I'm sure there may have been, but
it's an American produced and directed
Absolutely.
film. You need to have
Absolutely.
two easily recognizable hero that you're going to root for.
Steve McQueen.
By the way,
man.
one quick thing we didn't mention is that in terms of inaccuracy, in March it was snowing.
That's right.
Everything was covered with snow. So one other thing the Germans got noticed also was all those footsteps in the snow. But that would have been harder to film and not as
Pretty.
not as
It's
pretty.
a beautiful movie. I
It
mean,
is.
The
It is.
scenery's gorgeous.
It's like the 1960s.
Yeah, I mean, Bavaria is a beautiful part of the world, but we talk about Steve McQueen and his character. As we said, a lot of these characters were modeled off of one person or composites. Steve McQueen's character was a composite of, I think, 3 people. Dave Jones being one, the American who was a Doolittle Raider. John Lewis and William Ashe, I think William Ashe was a Canadian and Lewis was a Brit, or it might be the other way around, forgive me. But so he was a composite of 3 people. But anyway.
He insisted on having more airtime and doing this long chess. They had huge fights with the director.
Yeah.
Very difficult on set. Sorry to destroy your idea of cool McQueen, but he wasn't cool to film, really.
But he looks cool in the movie, wearing that
Yeah,
A2
yeah.
baseball glove and that oddball sweater that he just kind of pulls out of thin air because,
He's such a
Wouldn't
smart
have had
ass
that.
character too, like the sarcasm and that he has, and that it's just great. I think it's why people always remember him. As great as that cast is, I think everybody always remembers McQueen. as much as
Absolutely.
anybody.
The king of cool, man. My favorite
Or
line of
Cooler
his.
King.
Oh, the cooler king. That's right. My favorite line of his is when he tests the moonshine and he drinks it and he swishes it around, and they're all looking at him like, "Is it good?" And all he goes is, "Whoa!" Perfect. Well, can you guys sum? And I'll go the opposite way, Christelle. Can you sum this film up in a sentence or two? Possibly, maybe.
Yeah, I will say, it's a pretty classic 1960s movie with the large cast. I think they were doing a lot of those back then. Again, it's kind of a heist movie. It's an escape. The emphasis is really on the escape. Although the first shot is that this is historically accurate. No, not quite entirely. But it's fun. It's fun. Again, as I say, grab some popcorn, just enjoy, have your cat on your lap like me, and it's a good ride.
Jason?
Yeah, I was thinking about what would I say about it in terms of a sentence or two, and I would just say this is like one of the great breakout kind of films. You can think about all kinds of like Escape from Alcatraz and films like that have this really dramatic kind of build-up and how are they going to conceal it. And this film is definitely one of the classic films in that genre. So definitely keep that in mind when you're about to set aside 3 hours of your life.
Kim?
Yeah, like Christelle, it's I think the 60s, it's pretty set pretty squarely in its genre. So I see it as a 1960s adventure film and also a Steve McQueen vehicle.
Oh yeah, have you seen the poster? Maybe we could put this on Facebook. The poster for the movies, like Steve McQueen, James Garner, and then maybe a little bit the Attenborough, because they're British. We don't care. It's kind of interesting that they're fully in movement, running. So it's like this is going to be an action-packed movies, and
It's not.
yeah, it's not.
Not at all.
But posters are often misleading.
Well, it's Attenborough. This was one of his first American films, if I remember correctly, and then this again, kind of like this elevated Steve McQueen to rock star status, and James Garner and James Coburn too, but this did the same to a lesser degree with Richard Attenborough. But he's a hell of an actor. I try to sum the movies that we watch up with one or one line or something from the movie, and this one's kind of hard because there's a lot of good lines in this movie. There really are, and my favorite line is Steve McQueen testing the moonshine, but it's kind of anticlimactic to end this with. So I'll just say I agree with everybody here. I think it's a good movie. It's a popcorn flick for sure. It's fun. It's a fun movie to watch. It's enjoyable. And whenever I see it on TV, I turn it on. Now, whether I sit there for the entire 3 hours, that's up for debate. But whenever I see it on TV, I put it on. It's background, and you can't help but watch it. And you've seen it once, you've seen it 100 times, and you know all the things that are happening, and you enjoy it. It's a fun movie to watch. And I would highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. So with that being said, thanks so much for listening. If you'd like to hear more about the events we discussed today, listen to our mini episode next week, where we will share oral histories from those who were there. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on iTunes if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Tessa Jager, and our sound engineer, Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.